G'day, welcome to Bogan Intel. Today's guest is activist John Minto. John's been involved in New Zealand activism for over 5 decades, starting off in anti-Vietnam War protests, being the chair of the heart movement that dramatically resisted apartheid, including the famous 1981 Springbok All Blacks test, in which activists shut down the event and brought global attention, as well as starting a movement that came to our shores. But later on, John has been involved in chairing the Palestine Solidarity Network Aotearoa. John comes on to provide his unique insight into New Zealand activism more broadly, and the generational and class issues that dictate and determine its effectiveness. He will look at the differences between the more kinetic activism of the 60s and 70s, as opposed to the electronic formats or the hybrid forms that we see in today. So please stay around and enjoy a great show with John Minto. Thank you very much for joining us, John Minto.
Kia ora, Joel. It's really nice to be here.
You're our first New Zealander beaming in from across the Tasman, and it's about time we had someone from New Zealand on our program. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing a bit of a unique insight into what's happening across the Tasman.
No, well, thanks for that. Yeah, it's surprised you haven't had anyone on from here. There's a lot of interesting people live over here.
I hope potentially you could hook us up with your teledex afterwards and give us a few more. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'll get kicking off here. Really, you've been essentially a pillar of the New Zealand activist movement for 5 decades now, and organising mass protests. One iconic one in particular was the Springbok Tour, where and then over the decades, you've moved to co-chair the Palestine Solidarity Network Aotearoa.
Yep.
Could you maybe walk us through a little bit about some of the moments in your career that shaped you as an activist, and what keeps you going back 5 decades in?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I suppose for me, my activism really started in the mid-1970s when I went to a public meeting in 1985 where Trevor Richards was speaking, and he was the chair of Halted Racist Tours, the HART, the organisation that was sort of the centre of the anti-apartheid movement. And I'd been through university, and I'd been on the fringe of things, but I hadn't been sort of involved in any organising role. And I went to that meeting in a small place called Napier on the east coast of the North Island, and where my family was living at the time. And in a small town, if you sort of put your name on a list for a meeting, you go to the meeting, and suddenly I was the secretary of the local group. So, small town New Zealand, that's how I sort of got involved in my first sort of, I guess, official kind of political activity. And from there, joined HART and joined the what was called the National Anti-Apartheid Committee at that time, which was looking at, the economic boycott of South Africa. And my first big I guess campaigning was in Napier. It was against Rothmans. Rothmans Tobacco Company. You would have known them? Yeah, they were
used to sponsor the Formula One and all that. Yep.
Yeah. Well, at that time, they were owned or part owned from South Africa, and we were trying to cut all the links, of course, economic links between New Zealand and South Africa. And Rothmans had a big factory in Napier, so attending their annual general meeting and organising protests around that was the first activity I got involved in. And from there, the anti-apartheid movement consumed me probably for the next 10 years. And we did a lot of good things along the way.
And something that you speak to there that hasn't really crossed my mind, is about activism in smaller areas, smaller towns, in the regions and things like that, and how activism potentially works in the smaller town? What compared to the cities, I suppose? And
Yeah.
just as we're going to the next question, what would you say would be the difference? And what considerations does someone who's organising have to consider? Rural versus city versus country.
Yeah, well, I think probably the fact that I started off in a small centre, 30,000 people in Napier at the time, and then moved within a couple of years, moved to Auckland. Um, it kind of gave me a strong sense of, if you're talking about a movement, yeah, a movement has to involve, of course, the big urban centres, but it's easy to get blinkered and forget about the smaller centres. But so, like Heart in those days was very much organising in the smaller centres as well as the big ones. So we had a national network, and it's the same with Palestine right now. We've got a network of groups around the country, over 30 in different centres, and so we kind of and each group is autonomous, right? We don't have this big central dictatorship that says you must do this on this day or whatever. We kind of provide a clear political direction and resources and all the rest of it. But it's over to local groups what they do. They're the best people to understand, like, their capacity on the ground and all that. And I do think that's been a strength of certainly the anti-apartheid movement here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in the Palestine Solidarity movement currently at the moment, where every week we have people in some of the smallest towns in New Zealand who will be out there flag waving for Palestine. So yeah, so of course the smaller towns are generally much more conservative. So I remember in probably 1982, after we'd had all the big protests against the Springbok Tour in 1981, which was a really big deal for the country as a whole. And I was on a little South Island tour, and I went to a place called Blenheim, which is the top of the South Island. That's even smaller than Napier, so it was a very, very small provincial town. And I went on this radio show to do a sort of a talk back, and I thought, oh, that'll be fine. Done plenty of talkbacks before, and at that time it was a hot issue, so you'd probably maybe get 50-50. And I went on this talkback show, and the first 14 calls were absolutely rabidly against everything that I was promoting politically. I felt a bit punch drunk at the end of it, to be honest. And it was and the very last call, someone rang in and said, "Look, I've just been listening to all these people, and honestly, I've just moved to Blenheim, and this is what the town's really like. It really is as bad as these people are making it making it out." So there is that, bigger urban areas, you get a much more a much greater support for sort of human rights issues than you do in smaller provincial centres, especially those ones that are in the heart of farming communities, which a lot of our ones are.
And you're a teacher by trade, yeah, John?
Yeah, teacher by trade. I'm retired now, but yeah, most of my working career, probably 2/3 of my working career, has been in teaching. I did a spell 6 years working for Unite Union, and I worked for 5 years for the anti-apartheid movement. So that's, yeah, but teaching's been my main paid job. I did physics. I taught physics and science in secondary schools here.
And I wanted to ask, you've evolved from a student organizer in the 70s, you became a teacher, and now you're involved in, Palestine advocacy.
Yeah.
How do you feel like, family life, teaching, life experience has sort of influenced your particular stamp on activism?
Oh, well, I think it came, my interest and involvement came from, I grew up in Dunedin in a big Catholic family. There were 10 kids, and I was the third out of 10. And I was an altar boy, as you did in those days as a young Catholic kid. And at that time, this was the early 1960s, and at that time, the Catholic Church was going through this quite dramatic change towards a church which was going to stand with the poor and the oppressed around the world. And so Pope John the 23rd, had the Second Vatican Council, and there was this big kind of change of direction, although, I mean, I didn't see the change. I was more coming into it when the change was happening. So, I mean, we used to collect money for the poor. It was basically a sort of a charity model, I suppose, but inevitably it instills in you the idea that that we're all part of the human race. You know, we have a common humanity right around the world, and I think I guess the values around that were really important to me, and my family were always all the way through have been very supportive of me, and they came from that through that background as well. So yeah, I think that was definitely the biggest influence on me initially. And then when I went to university, you know, there were debates there in the early 70s when I was at Massey University here. Debates about, at that time it was a big debate about whether the Springboks should tour New Zealand in 1973. And so this was a big debate on campus, and I wasn't actively involved in that debate at that time, but I kind of, you kind of you kind of get absorbed in that debate, and the government actually stepped in. It was a Labor government. They stepped in and actually cancelled that tour because they were worried about the potential for civil disruption and civil unrest. And of course, after that, we had 8 years later, we had a national government in who let the Springboks come here in 1981, and we had a massive protest movement and a huge amount of civil disruption.
I'd like to get onto that Springbok moment, you know, essentially, and how the national, how the nation kind of got behind that movement, at the end, because I think it's really important that to get that traction and to see the elements that work compared to the ones that don't. In Australia, we have like geographical, demographical differences to New Zealand, which make our work unique in its own right. I find it quite interesting, you know, with the smaller size of New Zealand, how, you know, they're all independent, but how there's a coordination of movements, across the entire country. There's almost like a little node everywhere that you can almost link up across. Whereas in Australia, we sort of suffer a little bit with the distance, the tyranny of distance here. I would like to ask you just a little bit about the Vietnam War protests to begin with, and how you were involved in them in your university. And essentially how the landscape of protests and activism's changed in the West. But I want to ask you in particular with New Zealand, how has activism changed from the 1970s, where you had these like kinetic, anti-nuclear, anti-apartheid movements, compared to the digital age? How do you sort of see the difference here and how things have changed?
I came into activism sort of just on the back of the Vietnam War. I went to university in 72, and the New Zealand, at the end of 72, the New Zealand government withdrew our troops from Vietnam. So I was on the very end of that, not directly involved in it in any organising role. I think I think back in those days, in the 1970s, there was a real sense that we could change the world. You know, there was and dealing with New Zealand, like you said, I understand this completely. I know Australia just a little bit, but New Zealand, there is a kind of coherence in the national debate from one end of the country to the other. Whereas I think in Australia, it's a more textured debate with as you say, the geography of the country and what have you, and the fact that you have a very strong state system, which we don't have here. I think at that time, there were, I was living in Auckland, and, on a Friday night, it was Friday night shopping in those days. I suppose that you had the same in Australia. Every Friday night there was a protest in Queen Street in Auckland, which was the main street. That was where protests happened on a Friday night in the main street in Auckland. And sometimes you wouldn't even know if you couldn't remember what protest it was. It didn't really matter. You just go along and join it. There were protests every week virtually, and series of protests about a whole range of issues. So and anti-apartheid and was there, anti-nuclear, women's issues. And later on, gay rights. So So there was a kind of a sense among the younger generation that I guess the baby boomer generation, we were going to change the world in all these ways and bring human rights into the center of public attention. And of course we did those things. And then I mean, we had the neoliberal reforms here in the 1984 election. We fought really hard to get rid of Muldoon, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand and a deep conservative who hated trade unions, hated the protest movement, supported the rugby union, supported white South Africa. And the country, or the younger generation in particular, really united and railed against all of those values that he represented. So he was, in a sense, representing the war generation, whereas the rest of us younger people, were representing the post-war generation. And, the great irony is that we in a sense, our generation sort of took over politics in 1984 under a Labor government, which should have been a chance to bring huge improvements across the board, but they adopted neoliberalism, and we had the most appalling attacks on workers and standard of living, and it was just a really awful time. And Labor kept its activist base happy by making social changes like gay rights, like for the anti-apartheid movement, for the anti-nuclear movement, but in terms of workers and the economy, everything was done on behalf of big business, essentially, and workers were absolutely screwed over. And then when Labor left in 1990, National came in, they just sort of finished the job of screwing over the unions. So all those things were part of that. Today, with the
just to say, neoliberalism absolutely gutted our union movement as well. Instead of becoming an adversarial relationship, it ended up becoming like a collaborative relationship, and they ended up penning things together and handing it to their workers and saying, hey, this is the best we could do for you. So anyway.
I know it's happened here. We've moved to kind of like a service model rather than an activist model of our unions. And the union movement will have to really rebuild. And there are signs of it happening here in different ways. There always have been signs, but I think there's a more coordinated coordinated signs of that happening. I mean, next week in New Zealand on Thursday, we've got almost the equivalent of a national strike in our public sector. So we've got our teachers, our doctors, our nurses, all coming out, health workers coming out in a joint protest. So, you're not allowed to have solidarity strikes in New Zealand, but I'm not sure if that's the same in Australia now.
But, John Howard signed in a very horrible thing at the Work Choices back in 2006, where essentially collective, you could only have an industrial action during a collective bargaining period.
Exactly the same here.
You're in the rabbit warren. Sorry, the rabbit hutch. Yeah.
Well, look, it just so happens that all these unions have got their collective agreements being debated at the moment, so they can legally take strike action together. So I think that will be part of just it will be a significant step in the rebuilding of union solidarity here, certainly within the public sector. And again, there are signs within the private sector of things improving as well. So, I'm an optimist. I think if I was a pessimist or perhaps a realist, you'd go home and watch the soaps on TV. But things can and will improve here. It'll have to come through. It comes through struggle. It's never ever given to you on a plate. And in the new environment, just to finish off what you were saying before, it's very different now. I think we talk about having a sort of a lost generation, those people who grew up under neoliberalism, who the students and starting your life with a student loan and you can't even begin to save for a house until you've paid off your student loan. Just the screwing over of young people has been appalling. So the changes that have been made in the university structures mean that it's very hard for radical student organisations to develop in the way they did in the 60s and 70s. So, so I mean, every successful movement these days has to be online, as well as in the mainstream media. And this is something which some of our groups are very much online only. And I'm always saying, look, we have to be both. We can't just give up on the mainstream media, although there's every reason to do that. It's the reporting on, and you would have had it. I think it's even worse in Australia from some of the things I've seen. Some of the things that are published in the Australian,
the Australian, that's right. It was
the Australian. I've read a couple of those things that they would never be published in a mainstream publication here.
Even the most tabloidy of them all.
Well, I even think that would be. I think in something like the National Business Review would balk at some of that stuff. It's just so outrageous in the fact that it is untrue. It is racist. It is anti-Palestinian. It is anti-Arab. It's just shocking. But anyway, but our media, our mainstream media, they focus on Israeli narratives, Israeli justifications, Israeli reasoning, Israeli-focused stories, and Palestinians are very much an afterthought if they appear at all. So Palestinians appear as the sort of, the hapless victims of bombings, rather than as people in their own right, with their own agency, with their own sort of control of where things are going. We get but despite all that, in the 1970s, they would have got away with that. But in 2025, the majority of people are just strongly, strongly opposed to what's happening. And so when they do a public opinion polls here, I'd be interested in what Australia is, but we've done a couple ourselves, and there's been one done by Radio New Zealand. And basically you have 1/3 of the population who say they're not sure, they won't give an opinion. And I think I'll come back to that if you like. But of the people who give an opinion, 2-1 people are supporting sanctions against Israel and New Zealand recognizing a Palestinian state. And yet we've done none of those things. And we've got a government which is really shut up shop now. It's hardened its position, and it's not going to move on sanctions or on recognizing a Palestinian state. So you guys are actually ahead of us on that regard.
We have a Labor government that's very, very bottom of the barrel here. I mean, competing with Keir Starmer's government, I suppose.
Oh, shocking. Well, I have to say, if we had a Labor government in here, things wouldn't be as bad as they are in Australia, but they wouldn't be a hell of a lot better either, to be frank, because when push comes to shove, Labor has always been nervous of its own shadow, and especially when they face false smears of anti-Semitism, which is the bread and butter politics of the pro-Israel lobby here, and I'm sure the same in Australia.
Well, something in Australia that sort of sticks out is that, our trade union movement, our Labor Party, had a very intimate relationship with the post-war burgeoning Israeli left and the union movement over there. And there was a solidarity campaign between things. And, it was essentially apartheid labor, being used in Israel. But there is a strong intrinsic link between Australian Labor and Israel, and I wonder if the same exists in New Zealand.
No, to nowhere near the same extent. It is there. It certainly was there, but I think now it's I won't say it's evaporated, but it is very much on the wane. What remnants there are pretty much gone, I would say, from the union movement. We've got very strong. Our trade union movement has been very strong in its condemnation of the genocide and calling for sanctions. So that's been really good. And the Labor Party here, so they're the opposition. we've got three opposition parties here who would, under our MMP system, would make up the next government, which could be as early as next year. And if it is, it will be the first one-term sort of conservative government the country has ever had, because it's deeply unpopular. And on the question of Palestine, it's very, very unpopular. So we could see that happen. But what they've said is they will support sanctions against Israel, and they've given about 4 or 5 specific examples of things they will do. Now, these are not. So, for example, they will stop our sovereign wealth fund from investing in companies that are on that United Nations Human Rights Council list of companies that are involved in illegal Israeli settlements. They've said that they will stop. The government will not procure goods and services from those companies. It won't, as well as refusing to invest in those companies. And they've said they'll also support a Green Party bill that's been put forward here, which was mirrored on the sanctions our government took against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. So it's very much mirrored on that, but those are relatively minor sanctions compared to the ones which are going to make a big difference. So our labour movement certainly isn't shackled the way the labour movement may be in Australia.
Speaking of labour movements and labour movements across the Tasman, when I was a young fella, I watched the documentary before I knew about yourself, before I knew much about New Zealand activism. I saw a documentary about that day in 1981, and it was an incredible, it had left an indelible mark on me, really. And seeing the plane flying over the park and the pamphlets and the pandemonium, and it was like a nationally definitive moment in New Zealand's history of the highest order. And I just can't, I can't sort of stress to any of the viewers that haven't seen it to look up some of the footage from the Springbok Tour if you can. I imagine the doco could be on YouTube or something like that. But it's just an incredible thing to see, and the solidarity and the organisation by yours truly.
Yeah, it was. Well, I was national organizer for halted at the time, and we had a really good. Yeah, we were very well organised at the centre. But what we also did is that, we were a national network ourselves, but to increase the penetration within the community, we encouraged the formation of coalitions in all of the main centres and the smaller centres as well. So, for example, in Auckland, yes, we had a heart committee, but we had a group called MOST, M-O-S-T, Mobilisation Against the Tour, which kind of was an easier umbrella for a lot of other groups to come under than Heart, which had a fairly sharp and negative, to some people's point of view, public image. So I think we used the politics of movement building really well at that time. Yeah, I think that third test was really pivotal, and the other pivotal point was early on in the tour when we actually stopped one of the rugby games at Rugby Park in Hamilton. So the second game of the tour, we had organised to try and break into the ground, and in fact we did. We broke into the ground just as the curtain raiser was finishing, and the teams were about to come onto the field. We broke apart part of the fence. And we got 300 people surged into the ground through the crowd on the terraces, surged into the park. And we took up a place in the middle of the field, and we said, we're not moving here till the tour has been called off. And for 45 minutes to an hour, the police tried to get us moving, tried to move people off, and the crowd was chanting, "We want rugby, we want rugby." And we were chanting, "The whole world's watching, the whole world's watching," hoping like hell they were. And in the end, there was one of our supporters, a pilot, was flying a plane up to. It wasn't the same pilot who flew the plane over the third test, but another pilot who was he was a decorated from the Second World War, Pat Macquarie. So a decorated fighter pilot from the Second World War. So So he got a plane. I don't know if you got a map there. He got a plane and went and hired a plane in Taupo. And the police were watching him because previously in 1977, 1976, he'd flown a plane over a Springbok baseball match in Papakura in Auckland. And he dropped leaflets out of the plane. And so they were watching him, and he eluded them.
Never misses his target by the sounds of it, even his fighter ace.
No, he was. And anyway, so he was flying towards the ground, and there's a whole bit of a background of that. But the police were worried that he might fly his plane into the grandstand of the game. So they called the game off, and it was absolute pandemonium at that point. But there's two things about it that were really pivotal. Like the impact that it had was far greater than we understood at the time. And when Mandela came to New Zealand in 1995, so 14 years later, he said to us that he was on Robben Island at the time that we stopped that game in Hamilton. And it was the very first time a game was going to be televised live in South Africa, right? So in that before, they had delayed telecast games, but they never had a live game before. So white South Africans got up in the middle of the night to watch this rugby game. The very first time they had the opportunity to do so, and they didn't see the game. They saw these protesters on the field, and they were absolutely freaking outraged. But he said he was on Robben Island, and the warders at the prison had got up to watch the game, and he said it very quickly became apparent that things weren't going too well with this game, and he said that when they found out that the game had actually been cancelled because of this anti-apartheid protest, he said they grabbed the cells they grabbed the bars on their cell doors and they rattled them right around the prison. He said it was like the sun came out. So the impact on, in the black community was absolutely enormous. And at the same time, I met Wynand Klaassen. Now, Wynand Klaassen was the captain of the Springbok team, right? So he's a very intelligent guy, a couple of university degrees, if that counts for intelligence. But I'd met him, and he was a thoughtful, considerate person. I met him in 2013. And he said to me that the moment when he realized that things would have to change in South Africa, that apartheid would have to go, he said was when in that 1981 tour, and the very same game I'm talking about in Hamilton, he said the Springbok team was sitting in their changing rooms underneath the stand, waiting for the police to get us off the field so they could have their game of rugby. And he said we were sitting in there, and he said we could hear the sound outside. He said there was this boom, and then there'd be a pause, and then there'd be another boom, and then a pause and another boom. And he said, what the frick's going on? So they stood on the seats in the changing room and looked out those sort of top windows. And he said they couldn't believe what they saw, because this was on another part of the ground from the part where we broke in. And what the police had done is they'd lined up all these cattle trucks with the trailers, the trailers of cattle trucks were lined up all the way along the fence to prevent us coming in and making an entry, sort of breaking through the fence at that point. And he said what people had done were they got these cattle trucks and they were pulling them back and then ramming them into the fence. And this was this booming sound as this big iron fence would resonate. And he said he looked at these people. He said he saw someone with a dog collar on. He said they were old people, young people. They were just ordinary frickin' people. And he thought that was the moment he said he realized things would have to change. So yeah, these things did have a big impact within South Africa, much bigger than we thought at the time. And I think they didn't stop apartheid, but I think they helped to strengthen the international solidarity movement, and I think they brought a quicker end to the regime than would otherwise have been the case.
The butterfly effect of that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, in Australia, We like to inceptionalize it as our own
Yep.
efforts, where we, a bit further on, a couple of years later, with Bill Hayden, there was
Yep.
some movement here where the union movement made quite a substantial action, and
Yep.
that's memorized as in Labour history and in a lot of the centre left as
Yep.
this kind of immortal period of Labour. But the thing being is, and I want to talk about this too, with hope in my heart,
Yep.
about the ability of our little neighbour across the Tasman to influence our country
Mm.
on a massive scale through some of the actions it's taken over a history, primarily there. I mean, the
Yeah.
butterfly effect of that movement in
Yeah.
'81 really did kick off Australia, and
Yeah.
and just like Farlap and Russell Crowe and all that sort of stuff. We like to say it's all ours, but
Yeah.
really there is this kind of beating heart in New Zealand that does
Mm.
have as much as we like to deny it, does have quite an effect on us. And we see similar things in Europe, say like what's going on with Italy, then what happens in Greece, what happens in other countries, Spain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do you think that, New Zealand has a bit of a punching above its weight thing about it, and that
Yeah.
potentially, in the modern era, the way it's looking, I mean, FBI are trying to open an office in New Zealand. There's a few things going on there.
Yeah.
Can you see another like revivalism of like this mongrel spirit of activism in New Zealand coming back?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, well, I can see it here. I'm not sure about the butterfly effect on Australia for it, but it's certainly yeah, I certainly think we are entering a new era. Just one small example was last week we had the aerospace industry conference here in Christchurch. Now New Zealand sees itself as one of these becoming a big player in launching satellites for multinational companies, and they've set up a launch site. A company called Rocket Lab has set up a launch site on Mahia Peninsula, which is off the east coast of the North Island. And on that peninsula, they've set up a launch site, and so they're launching rockets and setting satellites off for different companies. But what's happened is that Rocket Lab started out as a little Kiwi startup company. It got government funding, and now it's been bought out by the American defense industry. So all of its work is defense related. So, for example, it's been launching these satellites that are for a company called Black Sky Technology. And Black Sky has an agreement with Israel to provide high quality images that helps Israel in its targeting of right throughout the Middle East, in fact, targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. So we've been challenging that, and the industry conference was here, aerospace industry conference was here, and this is a long introduction to say that the most uplifting thing was that young people, people not of my generation, but young people organised incredibly well organised blockade of that venue, to the point where they had 38 people arrested, and they had and all these young people being prepared to be arrested and going in a well organised way, and outsmarting the police again and again. And I thought this was a really, one of the most uplifting things I've seen in recent years. So I think that spirit is developing. I don't want to I'm using that as an example because it's right in my mind now, but because it just happened last week. But there is that, for the new generation, there are lots of things happening where people are furious with what's happening in New Zealand. Young people especially furious with the government over, and not just over Palestine, but over Indigenous rights. For the last 30 or 40 years, New Zealand has had this, what we would call a process of decolonisation, right? I don't think it's, I mean, it has been a process of decolonisation where Māori names are returning to, on our geography maps and for our government departments, and there's genuine partnerships being built between organisations and local iwi, local Māori groups. It's been a really exciting place to be around, and there's been a huge amount of interest in the Māori language and a huge uptake. And when this new government, this conservative government came in, it's launched several really strong, sharp attacks um, on this sort of decolonisation process. and then the fight back from the public has been astonishing. We had a big hikoi in Wellington, which was called, in December or was it November or December last year. Honestly, it was absolutely enormous. I was 2 kilometers away from. I was probably about. No, I was probably 3/4 of the way back in the march, and this probably won't mean much to people in Australia. But the march had filled up Parliament grounds, and I was still, as part of the march, at least a couple of kilometers away. The march was still moving, both sides of the street, heading down to. So I'm saying it was like, it was like maybe 80, 100,000 people took part in that march, and this was mainly, it was a cross section of people. It wasn't just Māori by any means. It was Pākehā New Zealanders, European New Zealanders saying, no, we're furious about what the government's doing. So there is this a real upswell of feeling against the current government. And as I said before, this might be the first one-term Conservative government that we've had in New Zealand. We've got elections next year.
And yeah, interesting to think that the government has just sort of evaporated in such a time based on its policy. And Labor, being the lesser of two evils in our scenario, has also been absolutely smashed, as far as its popularity around this. Yeah. But voters still unable to translate that beyond. But one thing you mentioned there was just the involvement with Indigenous people. How there's this kind of interlinking between every New Zealander in these protest movements. Now in Australia, there is some critique towards some of the executives in the Indigenous movement who are heavily Zionist aligned. Now, there has been a Zionist cohort that go around the world speaking to First Nations people, claiming that they are First Nations people as well. And in the case in Australia, there has been a compartmentalization of the executive, kind of elite of the Indigenous movement, and the punters, the Indigenous punters that actually have a lot of solidarity for Palestine. And I find that those elements are somewhat missing, those big voices. Some are even going over to Israel and actually actively campaigning for Israel, getting paid for it. So is that the secret sauce in New Zealand? This Indigenous kind of, this organic Indigenous involvement from the coalface?
Yeah, we've had some from an Indigenous point, some Indigenous leaders, but I sort of hesitate to describe them as Indigenous, but sections, leaders of some small sections of our Indigenous community. For example, Destiny Church. So it's basically around the Christian Zionist.
I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. So Destiny Church is the face of Christian Zionism in New Zealand, and Destiny Church itself is a very ugly conglomeration, I think. So it's very much a Māori evangelical church in Auckland, based with Brian Tamaki as its leader, and it's taken some appalling racist positions on all sorts of things. So they've had marches, for example, where they've ripped up Palestinian flags. They carry Israeli flags, but they're a small in number. And if you looked at Indigenous people as a whole, Indigenous people in New Zealand, Māori, are solidly behind Palestine all the way. We did a series of newspaper advertisements about 6 months ago, and we had the leadership of the PSNA, which is the organisation that I'm involved in, signing this letter alongside the New Zealand Māori Council, which is a statutory body established by the government to represent Māori groups around the country. So we have a very strong kind of alliance with Indigenous people here on the side of Palestine. And aside from Destiny Church, there's no other high-profile Māori who would be supporting or coming out publicly to support Israel. Yeah.
I find that interesting, because in the unions, like at the ACTU head, is essentially a vehicle for the Labor Party, so that they're playing ball with their, and I find that the mainstream bipartisan political line is being heard throughout many of our organisations, throughout Australian society, and within some of these Indigenous organisations as well, where the polity is completely behind the cause of Palestine, but there is just a captured elite that has a very different perspective based on its opportunity and its the things that they've received from their relationship via Israel.
I think that struggle's there, always there, isn't it? I mean, that struggle within Indigenous groups, or within any group of people. I mean, Palestinians are not unanimous in what they want or what they believe. They're as diverse as any other group, and Māori are the same. But the voices for Palestine are very, very strong, and the voices for Israel are just very, very weak. And I think there'll always be those tensions, and in a sense, it's also that tension between, you're talking about sort of middle class elites, and I think there's a strong class element to this, to the whole question of Palestine. We've had like I talked before about within our union movement here, we've had quite strong linkages between the Palestine movement and trade unions when there've been activities. For example, pay equity. Our government came in and trashed pay equity for women, and there were protests all around the country where, in a sense, those two groups were together. The women's group was alongside the Palestinian group, and we were, looking for common cause in those things. Where, essentially, there's class linkages there, which are really important for us to always bring out.
And on that, I think that's very apparent. I also think we've seen it with liberal Zionists gatekeeping or commandeering certain parts of the arts or the university sector that seem to be functioning quite fine until there's a genocide going on with Israel involved, and then all of a sudden the wheels are falling off left, right, and center, and it's actually against reason and madness, and there's an ideological kind of blind spot that many of these people possess. That's kind of
absolutely. Look, it's
incredible.
Always been there, hasn't it? Yeah.
But that's one of the keys, I think in Australian society is, these sort of gatekeepers, and you speak about these middle class people. I speak about this a lot as a working class person, the lack of lived experience in middle class progressives, and the amount of money and confidence they have in their life from their money allows them to sort of move into and gentrify areas and start sort of saying, hey, we know what progressive, we're the heart of the progressive movement. We represent because we can afford to be, and we feel like we are. But they come from places not too far removed from conservative voting families or from something like that. And they need to actually pay heed to the working class left to learn the ropes, learn the ropes a little bit. And I find in many conversations, it's the elite kind of left that seem to dominate conversation a lot at many of these forums. And it's quite hard for a working class left to even get the respect, let alone the airtime to get up and sort of go against the grain. Sometimes it's even under the impression of being aggressive, or something like that, or uncouth. And it's kind of like, they're that class. It sort of reeks. I struggle myself in that space, so I suppose I'm getting a little bit carried away there. But
no, it's good. It's really important. I mean, class trumps everything, I always say, and it's so important that we develop those things. And we have. I was at a meeting in Auckland a couple of nights ago, and one of the people talked about how really exciting this is, where we've got this, where we've got the developing these links with the union movement, with the leadership of the union movement, with the union movement as a whole, and its class solidarity being coming to the fore. And it's really difficult for unions to take action. I mean, our Rail and Maritime Union here have been looking at what steps they can take to be really, to take significant action in support of Palestine. And it's and they're really yeah, it's a very difficult situation for them because, you know, you're not allowed to do solidarity strikes, but that's the thing that a lot of them would like to do, to take part in that. So
Or
yeah,
potentially they could say, hey, next enterprise bargaining agreement, we're not accepting any pay agreements until we talk about Palestine. I mean,
well,
that's
that's
what might
true.
start happening, huh?
That's quite true. So when you're, I mean, there are those possibilities, and of course, once you get if you can get a couple of unions taking that position and breaking away, then suddenly that whole facade of you can't go on strike, you can't express solidarity. I think that might evaporate quite quickly, and we'd end up winning the right to strike again, officially, the right to strike again.
Oh,
Yeah.
not in Australia, but we can try.
Oh well,
Yeah.
look, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture here, but I guess I'm a natural optimist, and I see good signs happening. Yeah, good signs.
Look, it's good that New Zealand can act as a bit of a beacon in the Southern Hemisphere as far as, the Anglospheric mindset is concerned, to sort of maybe lead the way a little bit outside of where AUKUS and things are taking the rest of the Anglosphere. And I think you have the solidarity and support of, as we say in the polling, the primary, the primary populations in the West who are running counterintuitive to their governments. Look, I just want to speak a little bit just on the recognition of the state of Palestine in New Zealand. It's currently not happening. I imagine that's to the detriment of the popularity of the Hipkins government just on the ground. But as the realization of this kicks in and the political kind of shamans in the government start doing the numbers, is there a chance that this position will be changing more rapidly than the checks, the requirements that the government's putting on at the moment?
Well, Hipkins is out of government. He's but he has said, this is our Labor leader of the Labor opposition, that they will recognise the state of Palestine as soon as Labor's sort of back in power. But at the moment, we've got a Conservative coalition. So we've got the National Party, and we've got New Zealand First and ACT, and New Zealand First and ACT are particularly sort of right wing.
So Winston
And
Peters might be driving that potentially, or
Winston Peters is driving it
yeah.
because he is under this government, and when Labor was in power as well, they've contracted out foreign affairs to New Zealand First. So New Zealand First has been in both governments, and they're the party that sort of swaps to support whichever is the largest of the two main parties and form a government.
Make it till you make it, huh?
Oh, I mean, they pretend they're in the middle, but honestly, they've gone very far to the right at the moment, and they are. But among their supporters, there's, I said 2-1 New Zealanders who give opinions are supporting a Palestinian state and supporting sanctions against Israel, and our thrust has been to go for sanctions against Israel, because that's what will stop the genocide. That is what will make Israel sit up and take notice that they are, becoming more isolated, blah, blah, and it will end the genocide ultimately. Yeah. Anyway, so I think, we've pushed for sanctions against Israel, and our government have said, our New Zealand First have said no to recognition, no to those. No to sanctions, because their voter base, New Zealand First voter base, is more opposed to sanctions than support them, if you know what I mean. Like when these public opinion polls are done, among New Zealand First voters, we're losing, but among the population as a whole, we're winning hand over fist. Even the National Party, which is the conservative, sort of conservative, what they call centre-right party, like the Liberals in Australia, that party, even their supporters are in a majority supporting sanctions against Israel and recognising a Palestinian state. So, yeah, things have moved a heck of a lot in New Zealand among the public. They just haven't moved among the elites, and the elites are still tied in with, like our foreign minister has had meetings with the pro-Israel lobby here, pro-Israel lobby groups, but he's refused to meet with Palestinian New Zealanders. Just blatantly racist and all the rest of it. And I'm not sure if you're as bad as that in Australia, but
It has been. There've been parliamentarians, PMs having tiny meetings or just, hallway meetings with one group, but then having, back channels to the other. We had an
yeah.
anti-Semitism envoy appointed here who was
Oh, look,
trying to enforce the IRA definition of anti-Semitism on our
that's
country.
yeah, I saw that. That what they're doing is they're creating a hierarchy of racism, and anti-Semitism is at the top. Islamophobia is somewhere down the bottom, and white supremacy, somewhere else.
Yeah,
This is,
depending on how anti-Zionist it is, white supremacy is on that spectrum somewhere. Exactly.
of course, it is.
Because
Of course, I
they're
mean,
courting those groups as well. Look at Tommy Robertson in the UK. Look,
yeah,
this bloke is like this is the thing. They want the Nazis to like the Zionists, and then this is their perfect vehicle of choice for
a
their
perfect
activism.
vehicle, like Hungary with Oban, and like in America. I mean, the Republicans are riddled with anti-Semitism,
But they're
but
playing with fire. They're playing with fire because you can
they
only
are.
pay. You can only pay so many Tommy Robertsons off because there is an
Yep.
underlying, real, dangerous anti-Semitism in the
Oh,
right,
there is.
and
That's
it's
I totally agree.
yeah.
We have to be incredibly careful about that, and we've got to be you know we've just got to be absolutely alert to it. We have white supremacist groups in New Zealand, and when we had the mosque terror attack, it was an Australian who was involved in that. But New Zealand has got all of those things, the same as Australia, and there is a real danger of that emerging at some point. But it will emerge from the right. It's not going to emerge. It won't emerge from the left. But it is a real danger that we have to be aware of. Yeah.
Totally, and like the loyalty is really kept through some kind of beneficial arrangement with even with Destiny Church. I mean, I saw
Mm.
footage at the Tommy Robertson big march that he had, and Destiny
Yes.
Church had been like subcontracted to come out on
Yes.
stage and rip up the Palestinian flag and do the haka on stage, and
Oh.
you're like, what the heck? But the power that Destiny Church has on the social media amplification, I mean, I
Mm.
think a lot of these like Western right wingers, they love the haka. They love seeing
Yeah.
those guys doing this stuff, and this is kind of, the Zionists really got behind that. As like, look, we
Yeah.
have this incredible, like, noble indigenous people,
Ah.
behind us, and if these people can back us, then anyone really should. And yeah,
They've Destiny Church are they're very thuggish in their methods and thuggish in their behaviour, and they do not represent Māori New Zealanders. They represent a very small minority. I'm delighted to say, but yeah, they have a massive egos. Brian Tamaki, and he has quite a lot of social media pull, but they've stood. They've tried to establish a political party here under Destiny Church, and they haven't even got 1% of the vote. So they're certainly not strong politically, but they're very visible on social media.
and probably
Um,
because they're getting $7,000 a tweet, as we've found out recently. There's yes, an actual financial model going out from Tel Aviv to
what?
oh, you didn't even read that one? Yes,
No, no, no. What's this one?
the
What's this?
highest profile Hasbarists,
Yeah,
non-Jewish Hasbarists in the world,
yeah.
are getting paid $7,000 per post. So that's why
Oh,
we're seeing some real big video content just against
I
the grain,
see.
completely mad, because they just got
Right.
pandemonium. These content creators, they know how to make content. So you give them
Yeah,
that kind of job, and they're out there just going hard.
they're out
So
there doing it, and they're making a mint off the genocide in Gaza.
it's
Yep.
sorting the wheat from the chaff, though, and destroying a lot of streamers' careers as well. I mean, we've seen a lot of people go down for that. But look, I do want to sort of speak a little bit about
Yep.
the collective West here. And,
Yep. Yep.
I am looking at New Zealand as maybe one of the exemplars of that. And it
Yep.
always has, held that kind of special spot to be a bit of the conscience.
Yeah, we have. And back 20, 30 years ago, we kind of had that role, and we were quite proud of it. We'd done our anti-nuclear policy, and which absolutely pissed off the US, and we got thrown out of the ANZUS agreement, and most of us cheered. So we kind of the US cut their sort of defence ties with us, although they never ever cut the intelligence ties. So New Zealand had our GCSB, Government Communications Security Bureau, which is the Five Eyes organization in New Zealand. They never cut any of the sharing of intelligence with the US, but they cut the defense relationship, which was bloody good. And New Zealand really started to develop like an independent mindset, which was fantastic in the 80s. But this current government we've got is moving it right back. And Winston Peters, as our foreign minister, is moving it right back. He has always, in his political career, wanted New Zealand to be aligned tightly with the US, and he's doing that at the moment. And he is very keen on New Zealand joining AUKUS. But it'll be a much bigger fight to win that, because I think within New Zealand there's a very I think it'll be a fight for any government to join AUKUS, and hopefully it'll be a fight they lose.
Yeah, those pillar two considerations and all that, they just seem very
they
seem very counterintuitive to New Zealand's interest. And, the way it's embracing the Pacific, the way it's embracing it just sort of runs completely against what it should do. And a non-aligned country like New Zealand is worth its weight in gold. So it's good it's good to sort of have that around. Yeah, but on the collective West itself, I just want to ask you, essentially, how do you see post-Palestine? You can't put this thing back into the box. I think, the ceasefire, the one thing that makes the ceasefire so tentative really feels like the fact that there's so much information and footage sort of coming out of just the horrors every day. And we'll have years and years and years of this. And I don't think Israel quite understands how many thousands of hours of indelible marks are in the collective consciousness of humanity.
Yeah.
But the whole point I want to make is, do you see this moment, the post October 7 world, as a battle cry for the people of the West to rise up against this kind of, we've seen the biggest disconnect between our democratic leaders and the people in modern history. Do you feel that this is like a watershed moment for a collective global movement against the power structures?
Yeah, it should be. I mean, I'd add in the point that I think the US is a waning imperial power, and as imperial powers wane, their leaders become more and more extreme. They're all looking for, how do we regain our position where we were? Make America great again is in itself is a symbol of the declining power of the US. So it's happening in that context. But yes, I think there has to be a global uprising on behalf of Palestine, which bowls over our Western governments.
Do you feel it could also? Do you feel it could also be a catalyst? Like, the one thing I see as someone who believes in what you believe, and like the majority of the country is that these protests, that all the power structures want them to dissipate, and to hit a wall at some point, and everyone go back to their job. But there's a crossroads around here where these protests could become national movements that are calling for the end of neo bloody liberalism and asking to start nationalizing the privatization of our country and commandeering some of the resources that are being stolen from us.
I think that's really possible, and I think we can only be pushing as hard as we can in that direction. What was I going to say? I think like I said before, this the first time possibly we'd have a one-term government here, which would where all of those things are bubbling away. Like I live here in Christchurch, and we've just had our local body elections, and we had local body politicians are always trying to sell assets. They're always trying to sell our airport, sell our port. And Christchurch is one city which has retained those. A lot of cities in New Zealand have sold them off, or sold half of them, or sold most of them. We've kept control of those big assets here. And there was a public opinion poll done which showed that huge strength of support in the community for retaining these assets and for the profits from these assets to go back into the community, and only tiny minority support for the profits from these assets to go into the private hands of wealthy people. So there's it's a sign that the ground is there for that to happen, for this to morph into something much bigger. And I think the elites in the US are frankly worried about this, and I think that's why we have the ceasefire now. They do not want this to spiral out of control in ways that they can't control. And I think
is it the trick, John? Like the trick of neoliberalism is like you got to give a little bit. You gotta provide a little bit to the people so they can sit in their own ignorance. Once you take that away, what's the friggin' value of neoliberalism? If you can't feed your kids, if you can't pay your rent anymore, you have to create a false sense of security, or else neoliberalism does not work.
No, exactly. And I think they have to, and unfortunately, like our Labour Party, which is in opposition at the moment, is still in that mode. They are not coming forth with the big, bold policies that could capture that another moment in history where we change direction dramatically. It's there for the taking, but as I said before, Labor here is afraid of its own shadow. And I think
they're learning from our government too. I mean, our Labor government just took the biggest majority since the end of World War II. That they've got an absolute domination, and they did that by running a small target, bare minimum, because they knew the alternative was so crap and so rubbish. All they have to do is throw up the barest minimum, and the people are jumping at it. It's horrible because
that's the strategy which Labor's using here. And to be frank, it's the thing we have to remember, Joel, and we have to tell ourselves every day, is that these struggles have never, ever been led by politicians. They've never been they've always led by the community, by people, by ordinary people acting together. And in my lifetime, Labor has put good policies in place, but only after the majority of people have been won to that position by progressive movements. So I think the ball is in our court still, and we have to not rely on politicians in any sense, but to build organisation outside those political structures, so that we get the working class empowered to really seize control in a way that we haven't, or seize power in the way that we haven't seen in this country since 1935.
Totally, John. I couldn't agree more. And before I let you go, it's been great speaking to you, but I can't have someone like you on, such a wily old veteran like yourself, without providing a little bit of advice for potentially a young politically active person who really cares about some of these issues but feels marginalized. Have you got some advice to young activists that could maybe help put a bit of wind in their sails?
Heavens above. I think there are a lot of distractions around. We see a lot of in some parts of the movement, there's a strong emphasis on what I describe as identity politics, where it's where your identity counts more than what your politics actually are. That I think people should be,
The dangers of identity politics in
the dangers, the dangers of that. I think dangers of identity politics, but I mean that sounds a bit trite for a young person coming in, because many of them are coming into an activist environment where local organisations might be very much along those. They need to join those groups. They need to think. They need to talk. They need to engage in conversations about it, remember what that old bugger Minto said, that class trumps everything. That in the end of the day, it's not it's not the color of your skin, it's not your race, it's not your religion, it's not your gender identity that is the most important thing. It's your class and your solidarity with people within your class, and fighting for fighting for all these issues, if we're fighting for them in that class context where you go into a movement and there's things that you hear that you think, fuck, I don't agree with that, what that person said, blah. Don't throw your toys out. Engage with a movement. Movements are big, ugly, beautiful, beautiful things, because they take the energy of everyone and they push it forward in the same direction, roughly in the same direction. And it sometimes feels that that you're rubbing shoulders with people whose politics you disagree with in lots of ways. That might be the case, but work on it. Work with people on things which you have in common with them, and don't be too harsh in your judgments of people with different politics. As long as they've got something to contribute to the movement, they are valued and they need to be valued.
John, I can't tell you how good it was to have you on, and I really appreciate your time here, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of listening to you. And yes, potentially there's a John Minto model to be had in the protest movements ahead. And thank you very much for coming.
No, look, thank you very, very much, Joel. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope the people watching will get a little bits out of it. I will finish by saying this: that we started talking about film online, videos online about the Springbok Tour. The best version, and you can find it online, is a film called Patu, Patu, which was made by a Māori filmmaker, Merita Mita. A great little film, and you can find that online. It's about an hour and a half watch, but it's a pretty riveting watch too. Kia ora.
That might have been the one I watched, Patu. Check that out. It is an incredible. It's actually some of the most incredible footage you could ever see from a protest movement. The pandemonium, as we spoke about on that day, was just incredible. Thank you so much, John. Take care.
That's okay. Thanks, Joel.